And hello again. This podcast is going to be a continuation of previous file. What is the simulation? And in part one, we established that the first place that we need to look when we're asking this question is our immediate senses, because we are taking in information that is translated, and there we are. Our eyes and our ears predominantly, and then further from that, the magnetic fields that are generated by our organ heart, and how the brain translates this information, and what the influences are in the translation of that information. And further, where is all this input coming from? And we established, just to recap, that obviously we're conditioned within the first 6 years of our lives. There are multiple facets to that conditioning. We're taught and told through visual stimulus and what we hear and touch and taste and sense through our experience. And then we have the establishment of the reality that we experience from that point on. Now, one aspect of this, I think where I'm going to start with this is our personal experience with reality, because no two people are alike. As you know, some people, it could be the case that people perceive their reality quite differently to ours, but I think it's fair to say there's a general consensus on, for example, what is the colour blue, or what is a tree. We've come to a general consensus because that information has been impressed upon each of us in the same way. So we're all sort of on the same page, pretty much, no matter where we are in the world. And the only time I think that is left behind is when we consider more spiritual adepts, such as monks and those that follow the path of enlightenment, to gain access to higher worlds or a higher frequency and a higher perception of reality through what it all gets back down to, the five senses. At the end of the day, we are still using our eyes and our ears to interpret the world around us. So this is what we're really looking at when we ask the question, what is the simulation? There may have been a tendency to look beyond the human body, but I know for a fact that there is plenty of information already on various networks online and in books where we have learned that there are systems in place. There are certain frequencies being used through broadcast media and telecommunications and whatnot that we are bombarded with every day. And it is this input from the external world that we're really sort of up against first and foremost, because it's inescapable if you live in a modern society. And as a place to start, I think that's where we're going to be at for this podcast. So, in the previous one, we looked at the glands in the brain, and interestingly, how these glands in the brain can easily be paralleled, non-coincidentally, with social media. And we're going to just specifically look at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, because these are the primary apps that most people have on their phones. A lot of people also have YouTube. So what we're really looking at is information that we are receiving on a daily basis, within a system, within a pre-coded system, which is where the matrix underneath it sort of comes in, and how our immediate access to information is being supplied by who and what the end result is, and how this all hangs together to produce a general consensus or a collective consensus that we live in a physical solid world that contains suffering, and a planet, and a solar system, and a galaxy, etc. So I think what we need to do is break it down even further and understand that a large part of this input that is being fed to us daily is time code. And I've mentioned in a previous podcast that once we digitalize time code, it ceases being time and just becomes a bunch of numbers. That takes us a little bit into the matrix side of things, because all of these numbers have an underlying code, an underlying representation. But for now, I would just like to stress that all social media locks you into time. Time is an area of heavy debate, in that it's not a tangible thing. It's really just a measurement of movement, as far as we can see it and judge it and gauge it through what we know to be reality. So even when we look at time and call it a constant or irrefutable, we're only looking at time from the perspective of movement and how, many increments in between one thing and another that it takes to observe that movement. Through the physical sense of sight, which we have established is being overwritten by the input that we're receiving. So just to throw a spanner in the works, imagine, if you can, where we'd be at if we never received any of that input and we had no concept of time. If you completely wiped every single memory that you've ever had, what would your senses be interpreting? What would we be seeing? What would we be hearing? If everything that is currently turned on were to be turned off and all our memory was wiped. For example, would we be back in the newborn state? What would our natural interpretation of our experience as consciousness be? What would we see? What would we hear? So I think in just even considering that for a moment, it puts a very strong focus on how heavy and how blanketed we are within this simulated reality. You only need to imagine it not being there to get a glimpse of what might be beyond it, and at the very least that it exists. And I mean, in very simple terms, there's the proof. There's the proof that we have been impressed upon. There's an argument that, these people observed these things, and these people saw these things, and these people photographed these things, and that's how we've come to know that they exist in the form that they do, and why our lives are the way they are, and why they go the way they go, and why we're all on the same page is because these things have been observed and recorded. Yes. But through what sense were they recorded? for us to then see them for ourselves as shown to us by the people who recorded them. Well, these things have been observed and recorded by people who are observing them through limited senses. So all we've really been shown is somebody else's interpretation, sensorial interpretation, through limited senses. So we reprojected a limitation on reality, and it's been called our reality and life according to what a camera lens says it is, according to what the physical eyes say it is, because cameras and camera lenses are invented to produce a reasonably accurate interpretation of what our eyes see. And, apparently if you let in too much light into a camera, well, you cease to see anything at all. So where are we at? And I find it fascinating that the question of what is the simulation can be so wonderfully answered so simply by simply considering where we'd be at if we removed all the input that we're taking in every day, and the people who are projecting it and where it all comes from. I don't know exactly what the deal is, whether there's anybody in or around this planet that has the answer to what would be sensorially picked up by living consciousness within the same format as our human biology, if all of that was removed from birth. I do know that even people who have been subjected to that experience have had sensorial input, and that is of the room that they're in and the people around them. And there is a conditioning that occurs. So it's really something at this point that we can only imagine. And that anybody who has been subjected to one of those experiments is still part of the simulation, in that they're having that experience within the simulation, which is a frequency-based simulation, the saturation of frequencies simulation. And they're everywhere. We only need to look at the fact that mobile internet telecommunications these days, and the internet, the mobile internet is operating at the speed of light. So where's the way out from something that's operating at the speed of light and is all penetrating at a cellular level, constantly interpenetrating our sensorial interpretation of the world around us? It seems a bit grim, but this is the question we're asking. What is the simulation? Now, when we're born, we're automatically slapped with a birth certificate. It's got numbers and a barcode on it. We're given a name, and that information goes into government systems, which are now all in the air. They've all been put into online databases and computer systems, and they are constantly connected to our being. From the minute that we're born, we become letters, put in a certain order to form a name, and numbers in a certain order to produce a pattern, a signature, an energetic signature, which is our name and our birth date, and the numbers that are given to us on our birth certificate, with an awful looking thing called a barcode I mean, when you really think about this and what it means for a living consciousness, it's appalling that an energy signature is impressed upon us at birth. You are this, you are called that, you are represented by these numbers, and that is it for your whole life. You are also born within a solar system where certain planets are in certain positions, where the sun is in a certain sign, and all of this sort of stuff. And the energetic interplay that happens within that broader system. And you would know it as astrology. And how these subtle influences, which are actually quite powerful, also affect who we are as an individual consciousness within the solar system that we have come to know to be, what it is, with our limited physical senses, our eyesight, which is seeing a very small fraction of the full light spectrum. So who knows what the sun looks like or what other planets look like if we broaden that spectrum. What would we be seeing? How would our eyes adjust? And further, another wormhole is our third eye, which does exist. And we also have a pineal gland that would probably benefit a lot more from not being interfered with to the degree that it has. So what is a simulation? The simulation is when we are given input that is not accurate, or at the very least limited to such a degree that we're only really seeing a very small fraction of it. And further, in terms of the structure of a simulation and the matrix underneath a simulation, is the coding and the systems within that are ticking over every day, like time and all the things that we're exposed to, the actual structure of it. Now, where this may get a little tricky to comprehend, and it's understandable, I find it difficult to remember even, is that you might hear me talking about something like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram go, yeah, but that's only just in recent modern history. And what about it all before then? Our galaxy and our universe has been around for this many years. I mean, we're just a small blip. What's this broader simulation got to do with us? Well, it all depends on how you perceive time. The simple fact that it's not linear, for example, which can easily be disproven because you only need to look at cyclic systems. So it's never been a straight line. I mean, that's just a way that we've sort of portrayed it so that we can measure it and write it and understand it in a left to right sort of format. It's a helpful assistance when we're addressing time and how to write it down and measure it. But that's not time. That's just the representation of how we need to work with time, with our eyes and our hands and our typing and our writing and our understanding of time. I mean, originally it's a clock face and it goes around in a circle. And that was the original way in modern history of how to interpret time. But that's not time. That's the representation of the idea of time passing. So we can forget about those things right off the bat because they're not time. They're representations of time. So to understand a little bit about how time actually works and why I'm talking about modern technology as being the source of the simulation of this entire universe, we need to get an understanding of the fact that time is actually a man-made construct. Now, right there, you can say, yes, but we can see that we're moving. We can see that we're traveling around the sun. We can see that the planets are moving. Whoa, what planets? What sun? We can't say that time exists simply because we're observing it within the simulation. The simulation is time. It is that movement of time. That's one of the major aspects of this simulation, is that time has been put into motion. But it's not done go left to right. There's nothing in the universe that just goes left to right. It depends where you're standing and where you're looking at it. It might go up and down. And that's a good place to start. Time is a vertical. And when we start looking as a way of trying to understand this, if we look at time as a vertical, and the future being at the top and continuing to expand, and the past being down the bottom and continuing to go further down according to what else we might learn about it, what else we might discover, then we can see that the future and the past are connected, and that the future is affecting the past and affecting wherever we are right now on that vertical line, and that it is our state of mind and our state of consciousness that determines where we are on that vertical line of time. This is another conversation about, time, our sense of time being dependent, what era are we from? Well, you can go down a single residential street and enter 10 different homes, and I guarantee you that you will feel as if you have entered a different era in every single home that you go into. Some will be 80s homes, some will be futuristic homes, some will be homes that look like they got stuck in the 50s, the 60s, or even the 30s. Now, just because there's someone's got a watch on, doesn't make any difference. All the watch is just a bunch of numbers ticking over, with a date that was written into it before they entered the house. It's an abstract. It's an overlay. It's an irrelevance. What we are sensorially experiencing is where we're at. Our quality of consciousness is where we're at. These things are not determined by big tech. These things are not determined even by historians, archaeologists, NASA, or anybody else. Only we know what we are individually experiencing. And when we're lucky, we meet somebody else who says, oh my God, yes, you and I are on the same page. We are experiencing, if not exactly the same thing, but something very, very similar. Let's talk about this more. And in that conversation, a little bubble is formed where two minds meet. And suddenly, what are you experiencing? You are experiencing the first glimpse of an exit from this artificial simulation that is impressed upon us. But getting back to time and how, it's difficult to comprehend how mobile internet and social media apps, what they would have to do with the Big Bang, for example, or dinosaurs or ancient Egypt. Well, they weren't invented then. Not if you're looking at time as linear from left to right, and that the past has happened and it's gone and it doesn't exist anymore. No, it exists all the time. Just like the future is existing all the time, and the present moment right now is existing all the time, and the past and the future converge in that present moment according to our quality of consciousness and how we sensorially interpret our reality. So the relevance of modern technology is of utmost importance when we're looking at the source of our simulation, because this is how sort of far, in inverted commas, we have come in developing technology that could even cause such a thing. Marconi invented Morse code. And it was at this point that the pennies start to drop into place, that this is all sort of being replayed in a backward sense, giving us the clues. The further forward we have moved in time, that we are being led to a source of where this simulation comes from and how it's put into place and what happened and what they did to take high vibrational conscious beings and assert upon us the flesh, physical bodies. We can have a religious debate if you like. We can have a philosophical debate if you like. But as I said at the start of the first part of this, what is a simulation? We can at least all agree that something's not right. You might think, well, it makes sense that we have physical bodies. That's what we are. We're human beings. I can say, well, we're actually consciousness experiencing ourselves as human beings, and what would we be experiencing ourselves as if we took away all the input that we've been fed since birth? And we could argue about that, and we could debate that, and we could lock horns on that, and you might think a different way and I might think a different way on it, but the thing we will agree on is something's not right. Something's not right. We all know it. We live in a system that is hostile. As I said in the first video, look out in space, everything's exploding and hitting each other and dying out and violent. It's all very sparkly and lovely, which is interesting. There's something in the substance of that sparkle and loveliness that captures us at a deep level, and we wonder what that's all about. But it's hostile. And if you look at life on this planet, it's a survivalist's planet. Evolution has been pinned on survival of the species. Look at what we have done as human beings to try and survive here within the simulation. Ancient history is still part of the simulation, because look around you. You go outside at night when the sun's not shining, or when it is, but it's just on the other side of the globe. It's pretty dark. So there are things about this that are obvious at the outset. And when we're looking at modern technology and the impact that it's had, we also have to consider that it's had that impact on the past, because it's all happening at the same time. And that whatever's flying around on social media, through the glands of the brain and the broader internet, it's being broadcast at frequencies that are subtle, that are harmonically relayed and interpenetrative. It's just everywhere all the time. We are literally being strung up on frequencies, and the sound binary data that's flowing through them at the speed of light. I mean, what is a simulation? At this point, it sort of becomes quite a silly question. And there are other theories about holographic universes and fractals and stuff, and this is all part of it as well. But it's just that I'll get into that later. But for now, this is where we're at. Why do we see a planet? Have you been to space? Are you an astronaut? What did you see? If you are. And what did you see it with? Your limited physical eyesight? Or were you sitting here in your chair looking at a photograph that was taken through a camera lens. It's really not. They're representations of a form of reality that's in place within a simulation. And the question, I think, beyond what is the simulation is, well, how? How did that happen? What's pulling it all together? We can see that there's intelligence in it. And where does God fit into this? Where does our life source fit into this? Where does our consciousness fit into this? What is the source of our consciousness? What is the source of our love? And maybe that's a debate for another time. We can start getting into philosophical, religious and spiritual conversation about what our love is, where that comes from, why we are so moved, why we're all saddened by the same things, why none of us wants pain and suffering, why we all want the same basic things, why we all dream of a better future. We are all already on exactly the same page, regardless of how we interpret even what it is that I'm saying to you. But I'm just here trying to give you a simplified revelation that a simulation, the one that we're in, is being caused by the technology we're experiencing right now and has done since the Big Bang. What is the Big Bang? What was the Big Bang? Good question. So this is what we're engaging in when we pick up a smartphone. Activate simulation. Continue simulation. Then ask, what is the simulation? It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it, Elon? It's just a bit embarrassing. Where we're at right now with technology is also the future's past. There are things occurring in the future, which is not out there or down there or anywhere else, but just another possibility within this simulation. And for each day that we get up, we're one day closer within time, one day closer to reaching the source, which you can find in front of you if you look for it and know what it is when you're looking at it, because it's there all the time. The actual matrix, the actual coding underlying this simulation is there all the time. You only need to know where to look to find it, or you might be lucky enough, like I was, to stumble upon it just because I clicked on something because I had a hunch that might be interesting. So we can see that there are multiple systems at work within the simulation to keep the simulation running. Time code, radio, TV, music at 440 hertz, air traffic control, anything that's broadcast through radio waves. The frequencies that our ears take in every day that are audible to us. All our education being impressed upon us from a very limited perspective and taught as the rule for everybody to follow. And it's done, I guess, with good intentions. But erroneous to think that it's a blanket statement and something that everybody should adhere to constantly. It doesn't really leave us much room to move, does it? And sadly, that seems to be the agenda of some of the people who operate within the simulation in trying to secure their own agenda to run this apparent planet and everybody in it By the way, can you see 7 billion people right now? I can't. Just a small point. But these outer surface dwelling people who operate within the simulation obviously have some sort of agenda to try and secure an easy way of doing things where they can stay rich and keep everybody else in line. And but as long as we're offered opportunities to be them, well, then, they're being fair. And it just doesn't wash throughout history. It's there's always been injustice, and there's always been the egotistical battle that man likes to engage in over the finer essence of life, which should be respected humbly at all times. And it's just a little bit sad that we're at a point in our history where big tech don't really have any regard for it whatsoever. If they did, they wouldn't be engaging in censorship or developing networks or systems that are blatantly hostile networks. They wouldn't be engineering things in such a way that present imminent lethal risk to anybody engaged with them. If these people had any regard for the subtle essence of life and how delicate and precious it is, they probably would have chosen a different career path. And if you're listening to this and you work in IT, or you're a developer, or you're one of them, I'm really sorry to break it to you like this. But I think that the point that I've made is very clear and simple for anybody to understand. And there's been a few time. There's not linear, obviously. We only look at time as a reference point of movement within this system. The entire universe is a simulation. In my opinion, we're in a black hole. But that's something I'll get into a little later in terms of how that came to be. And our senses, what's interpreting information all the time, and we need to look at who's putting what into our radar that we're picking up. Also keep in mind the brain contains hundreds of thousands, I think even more, of magnetite crystals, tiny little magnetite crystals. And you're welcome to do your own research on that. Magnetite crystals in the brain and what they do and how they work. We also have a central nervous system that extends beyond the skin sensorially that we sense through. We have a magnetic field that's generated by our heart. We have processes going on in us all day, every day. Thoughts stimulating emotions, emotions stimulating thoughts, and then we need to look at where our thoughts are even coming from. I mean, if we're sitting in a simulation with saturated airwaves, how many of our thoughts are even our own? What if they're just sound bites from some movie script that happened to ping through the air via Netflix or whatever at that moment, that's attached to our personal data that we were given at birth, such as our birth date, our place of birth, our parents' names, all the numbers and identifying factors that have been attributed to us, that when we come online and our accounts aren't even under our own name, they have an account number, and how all of this information is moving according to similarity and sameness and resonance within an electromagnetic field that is highly strung on man-made input. That's a simulation. At all of our energetic points, we're strung up by what they're putting through the airwaves. And then here we are. But I think we need to be, first off, very careful that when we put ourselves in front of a screen of any kind, whether it's a phone, don't use them, by the way. Smartphones, get rid of it. Whether it's a phone, a laptop, an iPad, a desktop or a TV screen. That we are not merely passively accepting what it is that's being projected at us. Just because it's on the screen doesn't mean it's right. Just because it's on the TV doesn't mean they're superior. Just because they work in government doesn't mean they're an authority. Just because they have multiple degrees doesn't mean they're an expert. They're all just trying. And sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they veer off into directions that are further away from where we're meant to be going. So just because we're subjected to people and information through a screen doesn't mean that any of it's correct. And we've obviously seen that through the mass media. And it's come as a shock to some to discover that, a politician could be wrong or corrupt, or that the news might be lying, or they don't give us the full picture. And still these programs can't even answer the question as to why they're not covering all the really important stuff, and they're only still focusing on stuff that they've focused on for the last 70 years. There's plenty of information to put on the news. Why is it always the same jacked up stuff? They're sort of stuck in it, stuck in a loop. It's almost like you could just turn that stuff off and it'll go away and we'd all be better off for it. So yeah, this is where we're at, and the details of how this simulation works really would boil down to the matrix that's underlying it all, the actual coding that hangs it all together. Because as we said in the previous podcast, it's obviously intelligent, and there's obviously a mathematics to it and a geometry to it. And then there's that fine line between how much of it is the simulation and where does our spirit come in? What is our life essence? The source of our essence of our life force come in. I don't really think it's a matter of debate for atheism or, answers like, well, it's just chemical processes in the body and that's what generates this, and the charging fields and DNA and, all this sort of stuff. I mean, the DNA is one aspect, but it's the DNA that's being impacted by the simulation. So it's not really an answer for where our life force comes from. We tend to think that we are physical first and that we emanate an energy field. I'm suggesting that we are an energy field first that has been brought down to the physical state, the physical realm being one of the lowest vibrations of energy. Matter is operating at a low vibration of energy. And I'm suggesting that that's the end point, not the beginning. And this is the mistake that we've made as a human race, is to assume that just because we know ourselves to be physical doesn't mean that this is the source of everything. What we do have is a mind and a consciousness. Is the mind physical? Is consciousness physical? Of course not. So, given that it's consciousness and energy that is really underpinning everything, I don't think that we can leave our convenient answers at the doorstep of the physical world. So that's a little bit more of an elaboration from me today on the topic of what is the simulation, and how it all hangs together is very complicated but also very simple in terms of what I have discovered. And unfortunately, the people behind it, I honestly wouldn't want to be them. I really, really, really don't want to be them at this point. And to be responsible for an entire hoax that has subjected billions of people over millions of years, life systems over millions of years, modern history, to pain and suffering because of them. Like, you really just don't want to be these guys right now. And they're here. They're online as we speak. They exist. And there's no doubt a future moment where they exist as somebody else, and this is how they're just showing up right now for us. But there's people who did invent a particular coding and did detonate it at a certain point and did produce and create what we come to know as the simulation we live in. And freeing ourselves from it at this point seems like such a massive undertaking that it's really quite overwhelming. There's really nowhere for us to go until they go away. And I'm sorry to say that. I mean, we can cross our legs and meditate and go within. That's one way. But how do we know that what we experience, even in a state of meditation, is not more information being, fed to us through the airwaves? It's just our personal experience according to our personal energy signature and our identifying numbers, and we're just receiving input all the time. And then it sort of extends out to more conversation about what's creativity. I mean, these are all such wormhole conversations, huge cans of worms that we can open up and discuss. But I hope that this podcast has given you a little bit more insight into the simplicity of the question, the simplicity of the answer, time, and how time factors into the simulation. The fact that the networks you're engaging in forms an interpenetrative connection between you and time code. That time code online is no longer about time, it's just numbers, and forms a layer of the matrix that's in place, feeding you information every day. That the technology that's in use today is part of the simulation. It is keeping the simulation in place. And that the philosophical and religious question of who are we, how did we get here, what is our life essence, what is love, where is God, is there a God, is God everywhere, is the source of life everywhere, and what if we considered for a moment what would happen, what we would perceive or experience if we removed every single point of influence, every single input, and wiped our memories from birth. What would we experience as a newborn? As consciousness, what would we experience? Where would we be? Would we even still be an individual if we weren't given a birth certificate? Mind-blowing questions. Food for thought, something to think about. But as I said, I hope this podcast has just stretched out the implications a little bit more for you, and honed in on a couple more aspects and clarified a few more things for you to answer what is the simulation. And further to this, we'll get into the matrix itself, the underlying coding that is holding all of this together and keeping us imprisoned, sadly, in a system of very limiting beliefs that really don't belong to us. They're somebody else's stuff, not ours. And it's unfortunate that all those somebody else's have a particular agenda in mind, and they're not very open-minded when it comes to this sort of thing. It's a bit too confronting and inconvenient for them, unfortunately. So thank you for listening. Please, if you have any questions at all about anything that I've said, please reply in the comments if you have any questions. That's if you get into this video this far. I know that a lot of you might find these podcasts a little too long, but I'm hoping to present them to you as more of a radio show length for your enjoyment, and I make no apologies for the fact that there's no visual happening. They are strictly intended to be just my voice for good reason. So thanks for tuning in. Questions, I'm happy to answer, and I'll get back to you again soon.